everyone, welcome to this episode of Unboxing with Yoseka Stationery. I'm really excited today to be talking about some Kakimori nibs and nib holders. Kakimori released these last year, towards the end of the year, and so these are separately sold nib units and nib holders, and the nibs are really unique and special. They're metal, so they're made of brass. This one here is the brass one, which is kind of gold colored, brass colored, and stainless steel. And these are dip pen nibs with grooves in them that when you dip the nib into a bottle of ink, each of the grooves kind of get some ink into each of the grooves, and they sit in there, and that is what allows you to write with the pen quite continuously, and it soaks up more ink than, well, I shouldn't say soak, it doesn't soak anything up, but it grabs more ink up than some other dip pens would because of those deep grooves on all of the sides over there. So these were really cool and making quite a splash in the stationery world, I would say. The packaging for them is quite simple. These here are the brass and the steel nibs, and they just come in these little paper folded boxes like this, and with like a little check mark to indicate which one is which. And the nib holders, which are sold separately, come in similar paper packaging, and the nib holders come in a few different types. There's sakura wood, Tokushima indigo, urushi, and aluminum, which they spell aluminium. But so those are the different sort of finishes and materials that the nib holders come in, but I think the two most popular ones that we've been finding are definitely the sakura wood and the aluminum, which are the ones that I have here in front of me. And you can see the nib holders are the same exact dimensions, same length and everything, but the aluminum one is definitely just a little bit heavier and extremely smooth to the touch from the tip of it to the end of it, and it just has like a really nice, cool, icy feel to it. Really smooth, polished aluminum feeling. So if you like heavier metal pens, probably the aluminum is the way to go, whereas the sakura wood is super lightweight. Like, it feels like it's like hollow or something. It's really just very light and effortless to hold. Like, you could write with it for a long time without your hand getting tired. So here I have the sakura wood on the stainless steel nib and the aluminum nib holder on the brass nib. And the way you get them in and take them out is you just pull and you push in. It's actually super simple, and the nib holder and the nib are both standard size, so you could use this nib with another nib holder, and you can use this nib holder with another nib, as long as it's a standard size nib. And it just fits in like that with a little bit of a sort of a suction type feeling. It's not exactly suctioning, but a little bit, that it holds it in place quite tightly and it doesn't screw out easily. It doesn't just like loosely fall out or anything. Okay, so I'm really excited to be showing these two. I think people have been really curious to see how the metal nibs, the two brass and the steel, are different. So I'm just going to be talking a little bit about that. So I'm dipping into some Kakimori nibs. These are the pink lemonade and the soda glass. This is from Kakimori's previous collection of inks, and I just chose a couple of my favorite colors. So actually I'm going to start with the soda glass. So this is the soda glass, and I'm using it with the brass nib, and I'm gonna just dip it completely in submerging the whole nib, we'll get to see how much ink is actually soaked up in this, how much writing you can actually do. So, whoops, I kind of got it all over me. So the cool thing about these nibs, if you don't know already, is that you are able to kind of create different line widths based on the angle that you're holding your pen to the paper. So this here is like a pretty typical 45-degree angle for writing, and then if you wanted to make thinner lines, you could actually hold your pen more straight to the paper like that. Maybe I'll bring you guys a little closer. Oops, that's farther away. But yeah, so if you hold your pen more upright, then you get thinner lines like that. And then if you hold your pen straight, like closer to the paper, more parallel to the paper, you get these really impressive like marker-like strokes, like so, which are quite interesting. Yeah, so I'm just gonna keep going, see how much writing we get. And so we get a lot of questions about how exactly the brass nib and the steel nib are different from one another. And in the beginning, I kind of thought that they were the same. However, the steel nib and the brass nib, I've come to realize, actually have really different feelings. The brass nib, seeing as how brass is actually a much softer metal from steel, the brass nib is a lot smoother to write with. So it gives you a smoother feeling when you're touching it to the paper and writing. And you can see I'm kind of running out of ink here. And what you can do when you're running out of ink is just turn the pen a little bit, which I've been doing. So I think I've kind of drained it of all the grooves. It's probably because I was doing like this hefty line over here. But I'll dip it again. So that's really wet when you first dip it, as dip pens usually are. So the brass one is definitely a lot smoother on the paper than the steel nib. And what it's better for is actually these thicker, more kind of flexibly thick lines, which I think are sort of perfect for demonstrating inks, actually. That's what I think these nibs are really, really good for, is demonstrating inks and possibly doing some sketching, like very free sketching with them. Yeah, so I'm just kind of turning the nib as I write to get more ink. Like once this line is becoming a little bit thinner, you might be able to turn it to another side, like here, for thicker, because you're kind of getting a new supply of ink as you turn the pen to another groove where it's drawing more ink from. It just has like ink deposits in the grooves. Yeah, so I'll do kind of like a really thick, I guess, the thicker, I guess I'm almost out of ink here. So yeah, this is the brass nib, and I've drained it pretty well. So you can see, even if there is some ink on the nib itself, that actually is not going to get onto the paper because the ink supply on the nib is from those grooves of the pen. So this one is actually pretty drained, as you can see. Yeah, okay, so that's the brass nib. And I'm just gonna pull this off like so. And I just have a thing of water next to me, and I'm just gonna throw it in there until I can clean it a little bit better. But now I'll move on to the steel nib. So this is the steel nib, the steel Kakimori nib on the Sakura wood holder, and I will be dipping it into the Kakimori pink lemonade, which is such a pretty color and really aptly named. So I will dip it again, all in. Okay, so the steel nib right away, you can probably even hear a little bit of the difference between the steel nib and the brass nib. The steel nib is definitely sharper feeling. It feels like a fine pen as opposed to the brass one feels almost more like a medium. So there is definitely a feeling of difference between the steel and the brass, but it does the same thing where if you write on the tip, you can make thin lines like that, and those thin lines. And if you turn it on its side, angling it closer to the paper, you can make thicker lines like that. And then if you want to get really close to the paper, you can make super thick, broad strokes like that are just like buttery smooth and really satisfying. That's probably one of my favorite things to do with these Kakimori pens. I think it's pretty unique to be able to do that all in one dip pen, but that really fat, juicy stroke is kind of a lot of fun, and you can't do that with like glass dip pens or other types of dip pens. So it's pretty cool. It's a pretty cool feature of this pen that I think a lot of people enjoy being able to do. So one dip still gets you pretty far, and I still think that, you know, although this is getting you closer, like the steel nib here is getting me closer to like almost like a fine nib in a pen, I still wouldn't necessarily want to like write a letter with this pen, just because you'd have to be like dipping it over and over again, and the consistency of the lines are just not as consistent as a pen with like a fountain pen with a feed, because there's no feed, like it's just coming straight. Gravity is just bringing it down from the grooves, and that's how it is putting ink on the paper. So the line is not as consistent, but for if you're like drawing something or writing like a big headline of like January, I don't know, on your planner, and you want to do like some ink, you know, or like some embellishments, then I think that these would be really fun to use. So that's kind of my take on the Kakimori pens. They're really perfect for showing inks and playing around with swatching inks, sketching. They're fun for doing like big headings. They'd be good for, I don't know about really writing something with these, but these are really fun, and one dip gets you farther than most dip pens, which is kind of saying something really cool about these. Okay, so this is the steel nib. I'm just gonna pluck this one off and throw that in some water. And I'm gonna just fish out my brass one that's been sitting in some water. So It's recommended, because we do get questions about how to clean these, it's recommended that because there are these kind of deep grooves, it's recommended to run them underwater, but also to use a soft bristle toothbrush to scrub ever so lightly in between these grooves, because you can get kind of stubborn, especially if you're using like a pigment ink like this, like stubborn deposits of ink inside the grooves of the pen that will probably impact the flow of the ink as you use these over time. So that is how you are recommended to clean these, and then you're just supposed to let them air dry. And then these nib holders, you can see there's a place for you to put the nib into. So this is kind of where you want to clean, because you can get deposits of ink and like ink, I guess, in there. So what you want to do is rinse this part out as well, and then shake the water out, like shake it in the air with letting the water out. And then similar to these, you want to let the nib holder air dry as well, so that there's no water accumulating in the nib holder over time, because I guess that might damage something like the wood. So yeah, so there you have it. These are the Kakimori nibs and nib holders. Have you guys tried these yet? What are you thinking? I mean, these aren't brand new. I think a lot of you probably already have them. Do you have the brass? Do you have the steel? How are you liking them? Let us know. Let us know in the comments. Yeah, thank you for watching. See you next time.